Good morning, everyone. Well, I want to begin by thanking you for the incredible outpouring of love and prayer and support for our family over these past 2 weeks. My son's death has left a gaping hole in our hearts and our lives as a family, and we're grieving deeply, and I'm sure will be for a long time. But we have also felt carried along by God's grace and by your love and prayers. So thank you so much. I think last weekend, Jerry Sitzer, of course, came and spoke, and a huge thanks to Jerry for that, and I'll reference his talk a little later. But Pastor Rick stood up and made some announcements, including saying that I was going to be gone for several weeks. So maybe you came here hoping that have a weekend off from me, but I decided I wanted to talk with you this week. I wanted to be here and thank you again for your support. And I also wanted to let you know that our family, we're doing as well as I think anyone could in this situation. And then also, I just had a talk I wanted to share with you. And maybe it's for me more than it is anyone else. But about 18 years ago, I wrote this talk and gave it after a young couple in our church who are dear friends of ours, Chris and Shelley Brumfield, lost their little 3-year-old boy. And I wrote this talk called God Works in the Dark. And since that time, I've given it in a couple other places as I've spoken, different places. And this week, I just felt like it'd be right for today. In John 5:17, Jesus said these words. He said, "My Father is always working, and so am I." Would you read that aloud with me? Here we go. My Father is always working, and so am I. When is God working? Always. He's always working. He's always working, even in those moments when it seems like nothing's happening, even in those moments when it seems like bad stuff is happening, God is always working. Even in the dark moments when you can't see and you don't understand, you have no idea, life doesn't make any sense, God is working. God's always working, even in the dark. And what I want to tell you today is that, in fact, some of God's greatest work happens in the dark. And that's what I want to think about with you today. God works in the dark. Let's begin by praying. Lord, every one of us here in the room have either had those dark moments in our lives, perhaps some of us are going through them right now, or we will have them. I mean, this is a universal human experience, to have those times when things just are hard and we don't know why. We can't explain it. And so my prayer today is that you'll help every one of us tuck this truth away in our hearts, that God's working in the dark. Even when we can't feel it, we can't see it, we don't understand it, God's working. God's working and doing some of his best work in us. And help us hang on to that, Lord, and in the dark moments, really trust you. That's my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Let's take a minute and say hi to somebody. Would you welcome someone around you? Before I jump into this talk, I'm going to ask you to indulge me for about 5 minutes as I say a few words about my son, Jeff. Is that all right? I want to just... I think we got a picture we're going to throw up here. This is a picture of Jeff in one of his favorite t-shirts, the Little Devil t-shirt, which we weren't thrilled that he liked the Little Devil t-shirt, which is why I think he bought it and wore it. I'm only going to take, like I said, about 5 minutes to say some things about Jeff, and I told a longer version of this very abbreviated story I'm going to tell you right now at his memorial service a week ago. And I'm going to tell you just this little bit now because very few people knew my son Jeff. Hardly any of you did. And I'd like you to know him a little bit. And if you would like to get to know him a little more, I actually gave his eulogy at his memorial service a week ago. And I'm going to encourage you to pick up a CD of that at the Resource Center, or if you'd like to see the pictures too, you can actually order a DVD and see the whole thing. And I know that probably sounds really weird, a dad getting up saying, why don't you buy the CD or the DVD of my son's memorial service? But I'm doing that today because, as I said, very few people knew him, and I want you to know my son. And his story, Jeff's story, is really a remarkable story of uncommon grace. Jeff had Asperger's syndrome. And when we would tell people that, we usually got blank stares. Most people haven't heard of it. It's a form of autism that makes social interaction look very difficult. In fact, I talked to a mom this past week whose child has Asperger's, and she said to me, normal on the outside, different on the inside. And when you look at these kids, they look normal, but the wiring is very different, and the social interaction, it's like a foreign language to them. One symptom of Asperger's is that Jeff didn't like to be touched. This is how he would respond to hugs. Here's a picture of his big brother hugging him. And this was really typical. He'd pull back, make a face. And Jeff also didn't like to look you in the eye. Eye contact was too intense for him. He felt like you were staring at him if you looked at him at all. In fact, I'd take him out to a movie and we'd go get in the car afterwards and he'd say, did you see how everyone was staring at me? Jeff struggled to read nonverbal communication cues, things like tone of voice, facial expression, body language, things that you and I just intuitively understand, escaped him. For example, if you were having dinner with your family and you started talking about a particular subject, and after a few minutes you noticed that everyone had their head down eating their food and no one was responding to you, what would you do? You'd stop. Jeff didn't. He would just keep going and going, oblivious to the fact that everyone else had checked out of the conversation. In fact, here's a photo of us at a family meal. I think this was this was fairly recent. And my spot was there at the head of the table, and Jeff's spot was always right next to me. Now, if you'll look at the picture, you'll see that everyone in the picture is smiling except for Jeff. He's annoyed that I'm taking a picture when he wants to eat. But we always set Jeff right there for 23 years. He sat at my right hand so that I could kind of help him socially, through the meals. As I said, these normal social interactions were just like a foreign language to Jeff, and it's really hard for us to understand. But consequently, the last 4 years of his life after high school were spent going to school or work where he would hardly talk with anyone. He'd keep to himself. And then he'd come home where he spent virtually all the rest of his time. Our home was his refuge. We were his safe place. And our family were his friends. And so he would come home and unload all this frustration and unhappiness that he felt on us. Life was very difficult for Jeff. And he made life very difficult for the rest of us. In fact, I can't tell you how many times Lena and I said that Jeff required more energy and more of our time and attention than the other 4 kids combined. Well, this past year was Jeff's best and brightest year as a young adult. He was back in school, had found a program that he liked, and he was thriving. He had a good job. He was finally on some meds that were helping him. And again, this whole story I told at the memorial service, but for 23 years, we had been to doctor after doctor, specialist after specialist. We had tried every med in the book, and finally, in this last year, found some that were helping him, and were relieving some of that social anxiety. In fact, for the first time, just in the last couple months, he had started coming to college life here at church, which was actually his first social contact outside of home in 4 years. And he was doing so much better at home. He was smiling, he was joking, he had a wonderful sense of humor, he was happier. In fact, here's a picture. Yeah, this is, he jumped into this picture from the back, you can see. I can't tell you, really, I don't have words to tell you how grateful we are for this past year and for the better times that we shared with Jeff. Well, Jeff died 2 weeks ago today, on Sunday, October 15th, and we think it was an accidental overdose of prescription medications. Now, we won't know for sure until the toxicology reports come back, and that's in another 10 weeks yet. But what we do know this. We do know that he was trying to find medications that would help him sleep, that would calm his hand tremors, and that would relieve his anxiety. And on that Saturday night, 2 weeks ago, Jeff loaded up a big tray with popcorn and soda and a pizza that he'd ordered with breadsticks and dipping sauce. And he took the whole tray downstairs and set it up in front of the TV to watch a movie and laid down on the couch and fell asleep and woke up in heaven. Many people have told us that God put Jeff in the right family and that we were a gift to him. And we believe that. But our family also believes that Jeff was a gift to us. An uncommon grace. A very different boy who taught all of us compassion, unconditional love, patience, and acceptance like no one else could. And so, we still hear this a lot. People say, well, God put Jeff in the right family. And we always smile and say, yes, he did. Because we needed him. As I said, we're grieving deeply. We cry every day, and we miss him terribly. But we're also smiling through our tears. And I'll tell you why. Because we do believe that Jeff is fully alive with Jesus. And Paul Miller had a beautiful picture that Sunday night that Jeff died. Paul had this picture in his mind of Jeff worshiping in heaven for the first time free. And he heard Jeff saying, I get it. I get it. And I see in my mind a picture of Jesus hugging Jeff, and he likes it. Well, thank you for indulging me these few moments. That's the short version. Again, if you want the long version, you can get that at the Resource Center. It's, as I said, a story of uncommon grace. Well, let me go back to the verse we started with today. And I'm going to ask you, John 5:17, I'm going to ask if you would read this aloud with me one more time. Ready? Here it is. My Father's always working. Together, please. My Father is always working, and so am I. God is always working. But friends, aren't there times in your life where you wonder what God's up to? Aren't there times when it seems like God's doing nothing at all? Or something terrible's happening and you're wondering, God, where are you? What are you doing? God's always working, Jesus said. And then the Apostle Paul adds this, Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. God works for good, for the good of those who love him. And again, when is God working for the good? In all things, all the time, always. God is working for good for you. But often in our lives, there are long stretches of darkness when we can't see what God's doing, when we can't seem to make sense out of what's happening around us. And in those dark times, it's often hard. It's often hard to believe that God's working, especially for our good. But he is. And to illustrate that today, I want to just tell you some stories. And these are familiar Bible stories for many of you, and I want to just walk through a few stories with you that illustrate this idea of God working in the darkness. Here's the first one. Number 1 on your outline is Abraham. God worked in the darkness of unfulfilled promises. Abraham's story is told in Genesis 12-15. It's a terrific story. Abraham was 75 years old when God called him to leave his home, leave his kinsmen there in that area, and go to a land where I will show you. So, in obedience, Abe packed up all his belongings. He gathered his immediate family, and he set out for this land, not knowing where he was going. Now, along the way, in Genesis 12, 13, 14, 15, God gave Abraham 3 promises. Here they are. You might want to jot them down. First, he promised to give him a land. Lift up your eyes and look to the north, south, east, and west. All the land that you see, I'll give to you and your offspring forever. This was God's first promise, a land. Secondly, God promised him many offspring. God took Abraham out one night and showed him the night sky brilliant with stars. And he said, so shall your offspring be, as many as the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore. In fact, God even changed his name that night from Abram, meaning exalted father, to Abraham, meaning father of many, many offspring. And then third, God promised to make him a blessing to the whole world. God told Abraham that all the nations on earth would be blessed through his offspring. All right, 3 promises. And Abraham lived to be 175. And so for the last 100 years of his life, he lived in the expectation that these promises would be fulfilled. Let me tell you what happened. Number 1, the land. Here's what happened. At 75, Abraham moved to the promised land, there in the land of Canaan, this land that God promised to give him. And when he died 100 years later, how much of Canaan did Abraham own? Anybody know? He owned the cave of Machpelah. That's it. A burial site. He owned this cave where he had buried his wife Sarah and where, when he died, he was buried. That's all. For 100 years, he had lived in this land that God had promised him, but he didn't own any of it. He had no permanent dwelling. He was just a nomad in the promised land, living out of tents and saddlebags. Now, how many of you have ever moved? Could I see your hands? Okay. You know what it's like to pack everything up, boxes, okay? Have you ever been stuck in the in-between place? About 7 years ago, we moved into a new house, and we had 4 weeks where our family was homeless. You didn't know this about us. 4 weeks where we were homeless. We were in between. Our house had sold, and we had to get out of it, but our new house wasn't ready to move into yet. And so for 4 weeks, we were homeless, and 3 wonderful families here in our church opened their homes to us for a week or 2 weeks at a time. Now, this was no small feat, considering that there are 8 people in our family, along with a dog and 2 cats. And for 4 weeks, these people hosted all of us in their homes. And we lived out of suitcases and boxes for 4 weeks. Everything else we owned was jammed into our new garage. Okay, imagine that. 4 weeks out of suitcases and boxes. Now, imagine doing that for 100 years. That's what Abraham did. Abe and Sarah lived for 100 years out of saddlebags, breaking down their tent, moving from place to place. What a drag. I mean, I can just hear Sarah asking, honey, when are we going to get a place of our own? And Abe says, well, any day now, dear. You know that God promised us the land. And Sarah says, I'm sick of hearing that, Abe. I've been hearing that for 83 years. I'm sick of living out of these stinking saddlebags. When are you going to stop promising and start producing, buddy? You know, it'd be nice if I saw it in my lifetime. Well, Sarah didn't see it in her lifetime, and neither did Abraham. The Bible says they died without seeing the promise come true, but still trusting the one who promised. And of course, we have the advantage of looking back years later and knowing that God fulfilled that promise to Abraham's offspring. But don't you think there were a lot of times, like every time they had to pack up the saddlebags and move again, don't you think there were lots of times when Abe and Sarah wondered, God, what are you up to? You promised us this land, and here we are, years later, still nomads. Second promise was many offspring. And when God made this promise to Abraham, he was 75 and Sarah was 65, not exactly prime childbearing years. In fact, how many of you are praying that you don't get pregnant at 75 and 65? God was already way behind schedule, and then 24 years go by. Abraham is 99. Sarah is 89. I'm betting pregnancy is the last thing on their minds. I'm betting sex is the last thing on their minds. And then God shows up and says, remember that promise I gave you about a child? It's time. And I love what happened. It says Abraham laughed. Abraham laughed, and he said to God, "Oh, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing." Some 15 or 16 years before, something like that, Abraham and Sarah, not getting pregnant, had concocted Plan B. And Sarah had offered her servant girl, Hagar. And Hagar and Abraham had relations, and Ishmael was born. Abraham's son, but not Sarah's. And so Abraham says, "Lord, in case you hadn't noticed, Sarah and I are getting a little old for you know what. Why don't we just stick with Ishmael? Plan B, wouldn't that do?" And while Abraham is having this little negotiation with God, Sarah is inside the tent, and she hears what's going on, and it says Sarah just fell down and laughed out loud. And I doubt if she could get back up afterwards. All right, so not exactly top-notch faith from either of them, and yet God keeps his promise. Sarah gets pregnant, they have a baby, and they name him Isaac, which in Hebrew means laughter. Isn't that great? And God said, "Your offspring will be numbered through Isaac. This is the child I promised you." All right, so fast forward again. When Abe and Sarah die, God says, "I'm going to give you the land." They got one cave. And God says, "I'm going to give you offspring like the stars in the sky." They got one kid. Not nations, not millions, not stars, not sand. One, uno, that's it. And don't you think there had to be times during that 100 years that they asked God, "God, what about this promise? What are you up to here?" But they kept trusting God even when it didn't make sense. And then the third promise was, God says, "I'll make you a blessing to the whole world." Okay, now get the picture. Abraham dies at 175 with one cave, one kid, and a promise to bless the whole world through him. And can you imagine what Abraham was thinking? He's probably thinking, "Okay, God, promises 1 and 2 are not in the greatest of shape. I don't know what you're doing with this number 3. But God pulled it off because it was through the line of Abraham that God brought his son into the world. It was through the line of Abraham that God brought the whole world back to himself. And this was God's plan all along. The problem, of course, is that Abraham, like us, saw so little of the big picture. All he saw was his own short and small life, not really anything beyond it. But God saw the big picture. And you know, this third promise to Abraham was actually fulfilled 1,500 years after he died. If you didn't hear Jerry Sitzer speak last week, I strongly encourage you to pick up that CD or go onto our website and download the MP3. He spoke on Ruth, and he reminded us that God's redemptive purposes are worked out over time. Give God time. Give God time. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes years, sometimes it even takes generations. It was certainly true of God's promise to Abraham, wasn't it? Give God time. So Abe lived the last 100 years of his life in the darkness of these unfulfilled promises, wondering what God was up to. And I want to ask you, do you have any promises you've been hanging on to? Any promises that God has given to you? And you're wondering, come on, God, where are you? What's going on? God's working in the dark. You know, Lane and I had our own struggle with an unfulfilled promise. And like Abraham and Sarah, we believed that God had promised us, and I won't tell you the whole story here, but God promised us that we would have children. After 3 years of marriage, the first 3 years we were married, we did what many young couples do. We didn't want to have kids yet. But after 3 years of marriage, we decided it's time, and we began trying to get pregnant. You know, reading books, hanging around other people's kids, all the things you do to get pregnant. But we couldn't conceive, and after several years of going to many doctors and specialists, Lena's doctor performed a laparoscopy and discovered that she had what are called polycystic ovaries. And I'll never forget the moment when our doc came out of surgery and he put his arm around my shoulder and he said, "Joe, how do you and Lena feel about adoption? You're not going to get pregnant." And I said, what about Lena? And so we began to pursue adoption, and we did that with enthusiasm. We didn't see it as a concession at all. We still continued to believe that God had promised us that we'd conceive at some point, but we also came to believe that adoption was a wonderful God-given way to start our family. And so we adopted Andy as a newborn, just 3 days old when we picked him up fresh out of the oven. And 18 months later, we adopted Jeff, also as a newborn, just 2 days old when we picked him up. And as often happens, you've all heard these stories, the day we brought Jeff home, Lena's cycle started spontaneously for the first time in 7 years. And 10 months later, we discovered that Lena was pregnant with twins. And in fact, when we went in to visit our doc, the one who had done this laparoscopy, he came up out of his chair and said, "It's a miracle. It's a miracle." And it was. When the girls were born, Andy had just turned 3. Jeff was 21 months old. We had 4 kids, 3 and under. 3 years later, we were pregnant again with Michael, our 5th child, and we had always said we wanted 6. I come from a family of 6. Lena comes from a family of 6. We thought 6 was a good number, but by the time number 5 came along, we were too pooped for more. So that was the end of that story. Well, I love to tell that story because God fulfilled His promise to us, but I want you to know that before the promise was fulfilled, there were long years of wondering if it would ever happen. Many nights when we cried together. Disappointments along the way, adoptions that fell through, years of infertility and all the questions that go with it. But we're able to look back now and say, God was at work through all those years. He knew what He was doing, putting our family together just the way He wanted it. God was at work, working in the dark to accomplish His purposes. Sometimes the promise waits for years, sometimes for generations. Hebrews 11:13 says, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. There are some promises that won't be fulfilled this side of heaven, and that may leave you in the dark. But today what I'm trying to tell you is remember, God works in the dark. Trust Him. Second story. I'll go a little faster here. I know some of you are looking at your watches, getting nervous. Don't worry. We'll be done on time. How many of you believe that? May it be done unto you according to your faith. All right, here we go. Number 2. Number 2, Jacob. God worked in the darkness of self-inflicted suffering. The darkness of self-inflicted suffering. The story of Jacob starts in Genesis 25. Bible names are just so fun, I think. Jacob was a twin, and his brother Esau came out first and was red and hairy, so they named him Esau, which means hairy. Don't you love that? The kid comes out and they see him, they go, hey, let's call him Harry. By the way, his nickname was Edom, which means red. Yeah, red and hairy. Jacob, his twin brother, came out hanging onto his brother's heel, catching a free ride. And so they named him Jacob, which means deceiver. That's a nice label to tack on your kid, isn't it? Well, Jacob lived up to his name. And many of you know the story, of course, that later on, as a young man, he tricked Esau out of his birthright. In Jewish law, the eldest child received a double portion of the family inheritance, twice as much as any of the other children. And one day, Jacob caught Esau in a weak moment when he was hungry and got him to trade his birthright, this double portion, for a bowl of soup. Later on, Jacob tricked his father into giving him the paternal blessing that belonged to Esau. And when that happened, it was the last straw. Esau was so angry that he decided to kill his conniving brother. And Jacob had to run for his life. And he spent the next 20 years on the lam, suffering for his own sin and deceit. While Jacob was off living in exile, he met his match in his shrewd uncle Laban. Jacob fell in love with Laban's daughter, Rachel, and he agreed to work for Laban for 7 years in order to marry her. Now, what we're talking about here, this is a serious case of love, folks, because 7 years of free labor was many times the going bride price in those days. But Jacob was so wildly in love with Rachel that the Bible says these 7 years seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for Rachel. So the big day finally arrived, wedding night. But on that night, Laban switched the brides, and he gave Jacob Rachel's older sister, Leah. Now you're wondering, how could this happen? Well, remember, women wore a full-length veil, completely covered except for a little slit for their eyes. And the only time the veil would have come off would have been after the wedding ceremony when Jacob took her into the tent to consummate their marriage, and there were no electric lights. It was dark in the tent. Now, the Bible says that Rachel was a real beauty, a head-turner. But Leah, sadly, wasn't much to look at. In fact, again, the names, Rachel's name in Hebrew meant little lamb, and Leah meant wild cow. So it was dark. Jacob takes his new bride into the tent. He makes love with her that first night. He wakes up in the morning expecting to see his little lamb, and there's the wild cow. He had been deceived. And he ended up working for his uncle Laban 20 years in order to have Rachel as his wife as well. And over those 20 years, Laban tricked and cheated him time and time again, till finally, after 20 years, Jacob had had enough. And he takes his wives and his children, and he flees from Uncle Laban to go back home. Still on the lam, still running now from his angry uncle back to his bitter brother between the proverbial rock and hard place. And when he gets right in the middle between these two, Jacob hears that his brother Esau is coming to meet him and welcome him home with 400 armed men. He's terrified and spends the night in prayer. It's the dark night of the soul. Jacob's sin has finally caught up with him. All these years of trickery and deceit are about to be avenged. And on this night, the dark night of the soul, Jacob wrestles with God. And he comes away a changed man. In fact, so changed that God changes his name from Jacob the deceiver to Israel, the man who struggles with God. 20 years on the lam, 20 years of being cheated, 20 years of reaping the consequences of his own sin. But God was at work in the dark, making Jacob into a man of character, a prince, a man who wrestles with God. And I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but every one of us in this room have struggled in the darkness of the consequence of our own sin and failure. The Bible says we reap what we sow. There's an inescapable harvest. You reap the consequences of your choices and actions, good or bad. But the Bible says that even in those dark moments when we're reaping the ugly harvest of our sin, even in those dark moments, God is working. God is working in the dark to make us the people He wants us to be. And some of you right now find yourself struggling in the darkness of difficult times brought on by your own poor choices. And rather than being angry with God for what you're suffering and shaking your fist at Him, I encourage you to humble yourself before Him and trust Him that God's working right now. God's working right now in the dark, making you the person you ought to be. Number three, Joseph. God worked in the darkness of pain inflicted by others. Jacob's pain was self-induced. Joseph was pain inflicted by others. Now, Joseph was a dreamer, and as a young man, he had a dream that God would exalt him one day so that all of his brothers and even his mother and father would come and bow down before him. Now, let me give you some advice. If you ever have a dream that your family would come and bow down before you, keep it to yourself. Joseph didn't win him any points with his family. His brothers hated him. He was already his father's pet. And so the brothers took the first chance they got to be rid of this young dreamer. They were going to kill him, and at the last moment decided instead to be nice and just sell him off as a slave to a passing band of traders. These traders took him to Egypt and sold him there as a slave. Joseph was 17 years old. But it says God blessed Joseph in Egypt and gave him favor with his master, and soon Joseph was Potiphar's most trusted slave and was placed over all of the affairs of Potiphar's house. Then disaster struck again, this time in the form of Potiphar's wife, who got the hots for Joseph. By the way, there is a verse in Genesis. It's one of my favorite verses in the Bible. It's a very short verse, and all it says is, Joseph was strong and well built. Some of you are just now putting that together, but thank you. So when Joseph spurned Potiphar's wife's sexual advances, she got angry and accused him of rape, which of course he hadn't done. And Joseph found himself now in prison. But God blessed Joseph in prison, gave him favor with the warden, and soon Joseph was in charge of the prison and was running everything there. One day, two prisoners, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, had dreams. And Joseph interpreted those dreams, in essence, told them that one of them would die and the other would live and be restored to his position. And Joseph asked the one who would live to remember him, to tell Pharaoh that Joseph had been unjustly accused and imprisoned. But the cupbearer forgot all about Joseph once he got out. Until finally, one day, Pharaoh had a dream that no one could interpret. Then the cupbearer remembered. And when Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream, well, Pharaoh made him prime minister over all of Egypt. No one had more power in Egypt than Joseph did, except Pharaoh himself. Now, when Pharaoh's dreams came true and famine gripped the whole region, Joseph's brothers came from Canaan to Egypt seeking food. And there they bowed down to Joseph, just as so many years before he had seen in his dream. But of course, they had no idea it was their baby brother. They assumed he was long dead. When Joseph revealed himself to them, the brothers were absolutely terrified. I mean, here's now the second most powerful man in Egypt and in a position to exact his revenge on them. But here's what Joseph said. Genesis 50, verse 20. It's one of the most profound verses in the Bible. Joseph said, "Don't be afraid, my brothers. I won't hurt you. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what's now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph was somehow able to see the purposes of God, the redemptive purposes of God being achieved through his suffering at the hands of other people. Now, there had to be lots of time during all those years of slavery and imprisonment. Don't you think there were lots of times when Joseph wondered, what is going on? God, what about that dream I had? What am I doing here in Egypt, in slavery, in prison, far from my family and all that matters to me? God, why am I suffering for my brother's sin, for Potiphar's wife's deception, for Pharaoh's cupbearer's forgetfulness? Why am I suffering for their failures? And I'll bet everyone in the room has had moments like that where you wonder, why am I suffering? It's so unfair that I'm paying the price for someone else's stupidity. But God's at work in the dark. God was at work that whole time in Joseph's life, accomplishing his purposes. And we know that God's at work in your life too, because God is always working, even in the dark. So give God time. Give God time and see what he does. Number 4, Moses, the darkness of unrealized expectations. And I'd like to read here from Acts chapter 7, a very brief summary of the Moses story. It says, when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his fellow Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Verse 25. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day, Moses came upon 2 Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Man, you're brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" And when Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. Moses had great expectations. He'd grown up in the court of Pharaoh, a prince of Egypt, and yet he had never forgotten his heritage or his people. He believed that God had strategically placed him where he was so that he could lead God's people to freedom. And the time had come to act, and he acted. But the Israelites rejected his leadership, and Moses was now forced to flee Egypt, running for his life to Midian, where he got a job tending sheep. Now, put this in your mind. Here's a guy who moves from the center of Egyptian culture and power to the backside of a Midianite desert. He moves from the power of the throne to the poverty of a nomadic shepherd. He moves from great expectations of being God's chosen deliverer to the despair of rejection, shattered dreams, and hopelessness. And Moses, for 40 years, abandons all of his dreams. He gives up all those expectations, and he just settles down to tend sheep. And then after 40 years, God shows up one day in a burning bush and rekindles this dream of leading God's people to freedom. 40 years of forgotten dreams. 40 years of waiting and wandering in the darkness of unrealized expectations. 40 years of sitting there thinking, what happened, God? And folks, when you're watching sheep in a desert, you got lots of time to think. Isn't that true? And there are a lot of moments when Moses had to sit there and wonder, God, what happened back there? What happened? I thought you had a purpose, a plan for my life. I thought you were going to use me to deliver your people. What happened? Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever struggled through the darkness of unrealized expectations or dreams? A relationship that you expected to last forever disintegrates, and it leaves you wondering, what happened, God? What happened? You had great expectations for a child who seems to be wasting his potential, and you wonder, God, what's going on? You were sure that promotion and raise were yours, so sure that you already spent the first month's raise, but the boss gave it to someone else. The big deal falls through, the perfect job doesn't work out. A friend is sick, you pray and expect a miracle. Instead of getting well, he dies. I don't think there's a person in the room who hasn't struggled with the darkness of unrealized expectations. And today, what I want you to hear is that God's working in the dark. For all those 40 years out in the backside of the Midianite desert, when Moses was wondering, God, what happened? God was at work, preparing a man. And God is working in you, in your life right now, even when you can't see it. God's at work in the dark. Trust him. Number 5, the last one. The last one, of course, is the most important and the supreme example of God working in the dark. Jesus, God worked in the darkness of death. There's never been a darker moment in human history than when sinful men nailed God's sinless Son to the cross. And lest we think that that was someone else's fault, the Bible's clear that it's my sin and your sin that put him there. We had a hand, every one of us in the room, we had a hand in murdering God's Son. In that darkest of moments, it looked like evil had triumphed. And I have no doubt that Jesus' followers, as they saw their leader suffering and dying on a cross, I have no doubt that they were overwhelmed with sorrow, confusion, and pain, and that they fled that scene wondering, God, what happened? What happened? What they could not see in that dark moment was that God was working to redeem the world. And in humanity's darkest moment, God was doing his greatest work, bringing lost people like you and me back to himself. In the darkness of Jesus' death, God worked to save us. And one of the things that has comforted me no end in the last 2 weeks is to know that my Heavenly Father knows what it's like to lose a son. You know, as a pastor, I've been doing this pastor thing for a long time now. I can't tell you how many moms and dads I've sat with who've had a child die, and I've wept with them and put my arms around them and said, there's nothing harder than losing a child. And I've known that in my head. It's another thing to know it in your heart. And one of the reasons I wanted to give this talk today was I wanted you to know. I wanted you to know that our family, right now, our family believes God is working in our darkness. We can't see it. We don't know for sure what he's up to. But we know that God's always working. And we know that he's working redemptively. And somehow God is going to use our loss, the death of my son, to further his redemptive purposes in the world. And somehow, and I don't think I'll really get to see this until I get to heaven, but I think when I get there, and God lets me see the whole big redemptive story laid out in front of me, I think I'll see that Jeff's life and death won't be in vain, that God was working even in the darkness of his death to bring about his redemptive purposes. God certainly did that in the death of his son. In World War II, during the bombing of London, German bombers would fly over the city, the lights would all go out. And one night, a father was walking with his little son when the bombers came, and they were far from home and couldn't get back. And so they sought shelter in a cradle that had been made by a bomb. And the father jumped down into this crater, and he held up his arms, and he cried for his son to follow him. And standing there on the rim of this crater, in the dark, this little boy looking down into the darkness, this little guy was terrified. And he heard his father calling, "Jump, jump." And the little boy stood there crying and said, "But Father, I can't see you." And the father, looking up at his son silhouetted against a burning night sky, shouted, "But I can see you. I can see you, son. Jump." And the boy jumped. He jumped into the darkness because he trusted his father. And every one of us have moments when, like that boy, we stand on a rim of darkness and we can't see. But God sees you. God sees you. You may not know what's going on, but God knows, and you can trust him because God's at work even in the dark. Let's pray. Lord, there are lots of people here in the room experiencing their own dark moments. It might be an unfulfilled promise, an unrealized dream or expectation. It might be some suffering or pain caused by their own failure or by someone else's. Or maybe like me, experiencing the darkness of death, the loss of someone they love. Or it might be something altogether different than any of those. And God, I believe you're working right now in our lives, every one of us, even in those dark moments. And my prayer is so simple today. Help us take the jump. Help us believe that even though we can't see, you see us. And you're there to catch us when we trust you. So help us trust you and give you time to work out your redemptive purposes in our lives. That's our prayer today in Jesus' name. Thank you, Lord. Amen. Amen. Let's stand together. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Have a great week.